You can make a good argument about Roe versus Wade being a form of judicial legislation. But repealing it, not just repealing Roe versus Wade, but the whole argument about the Constitution clearly intending to protect privacy, which was the basic philosophical argument that Roe versus Wade was argued on, they want to undo that too. And if you undid it, that would be sweeping judicial legislation. It would just be sweeping judicial legislation going the other way. One of the things that the justices on Roe versus Wade were arguing was that if you take the Bill of Rights and you take all of the things that say you cannot have illegal search and seizure, and you need to have a warrant, and the government can't tell you what to do in terms of free speech, etc., and they added it up and said privacy. Well, that's not something they invented in 1973. That had been the trend of the courts through the 20th century. And they just recapitulated it, re-articulated it, and used it as the basis for a landmark decision that changed law in other ways. So to take that back and to do what, say, Scalia and Thomas might want to do and undo not just Roe versus Wade, but this whole concept of privacy is guaranteed by all of the Bill of Rights together, that would be legislating from the bench. So what they're saying is we're against legislating from the bench, and we want to come in and have our turn to legislate from the bench. Yeah. So, you know, that's part of the language you have to understand. Now that I've said that, actually, I'm going to sort of try and take another lesson and show that sometimes the good guys use legislation or use initiatives that might have been initiated by the bad guys. And that's troublesome. That's a problem. But we have to know that that happens sometimes. Because the amendment in the Florida Constitution that I am so worried about, and most of us are so worried about, that stipulates that no Florida funds will be used to fund any sort of religious organization, does not have a nice starting point. It has a very negative one, or at least according to some people. Separation of church and state is my thing. My strongest arguments for me, that persuade me, on Amendment 2 and how bad Amendment 2 is also tie in with the whole question of separation of church and state. I think it's a little bit harder to make the argument that Amendment 2 is a separation issue, but I think it is. And so I'm going to eventually get to that. But if you look at the idea of separation of church and state in America, just very briefly, it goes back and forth. We have a myth in the United States that the Puritans came to America in order to establish religious freedom. Absolutely and totally wrong. They came to America to escape religious persecution and set up their own theocracy here. They chased Baptists and Quakers and Anabaptists out of Plymouth Colony and out of Massachusetts, so that the first colony that was actually established based on religious principles or religious freedom principles was Rhode Island, which was founded by people who were being persecuted by the Puritans in Massachusetts. Okay? So the idea of religious liberty is a rocky one. It's not a smooth one. It's not a clean and nice one as we sometimes imagine. Our first major opponent, though, for the Puritans and all the other groups, whether they were Quakers or Methodists or other dissenters, was the Church of England. That was the official church. That was the enemy. That's who you wanted to get out. But not everybody agreed on that. Patrick Henry wanted to make the Church of England the official church of Virginia, and fortunately we had Jefferson and Madison fighting against that. And Jefferson and Madison were particularly outraged at the treatment of Baptists who were thrown into jail in Virginia for refusing to pay the tax in Virginia to support the Anglican Church. The Baptists in the early days of the United States were among the strongest and most reliable supporters of separation of church and state?
Because they're a minority.
Well, there are all sorts of reasons, but they have a long tradition of fierce support for separation of church and state. When the Baptist movement started breaking up, you had groups going in different directions, but it's important to know that. It's also important to know that even after the adoption of the Bill of Rights of our Constitution, even after the adoption of Article 6 of the Constitution, which clearly says there shall be no religious test to serve in any government position of the United States or any of the several states, which means that the interview with Obama and McCain by that minister, I can't remember his name, McGuire, violates the very spirit of the Constitution of the United States. Even though we had that, in the early days of the United States, there was still persecution against Jews, Quakers, and Catholics. The predominant culture in the country was mainstream Protestant. So you had prayers in the school, you had prayers in Congress, even though John Adams said it was a travesty. You had this strong religious culture, mainly maintained by Presbyterians and Episcopalians, Anglicans, Methodists, and the mainstream groups, and keeping groups like the Jews and the Catholics sort of on the side. Don't rock the boat, we'll treat you nice, but just shut up. And then, in the late 1800s, you suddenly started getting huge, gigantic waves of immigrants. And the overwhelming majority, it seemed, of those immigrants were Catholic. From Italy, from Ireland, from Poland, from Ukraine, from all over the place. There were other groups too, but they were the biggest groups. And there was a fear on the part of some people that Catholics would swamp America, which was a good Protestant country. When I was little, living in Oak Park, Michigan, I went to John Tyler School. John Tyler was one of the most forgettable presidents of the United States. And I only found out later when I was in college that John Tyler, who became president because Tippecanoe died, didn't get reelected and then became the head of the Native Americanist Party, whose main party platform was keep the Catholics out. So I was not very proud to have gone to John Tyler School. Unfortunately, they changed the name of the school too. But at any rate, in the late 1800s, there was a Speaker of the House named Blaine, James Blaine, who tried to get an amendment passed to the Constitution that would sound wonderful to us today, that would have read almost exactly like the article in the Florida Constitution. And that's not a coincidence. It would have said, no government money can go to any religious organization for any purpose. And it didn't pass, even though there was a fair amount of support for it. And when it didn't pass, the supporters of the amendment around the country went and tried to get that amendment added to state to state constitutions, and succeeded in 36 states, including Florida. And those amendments were known as the Blaine Amendments.